Hi, and welcome to episode 104 of Toke Signals TV, where we bring you the biggest in cannabis and hemp news stories every week. I'm Steve Elliott, the editor at tokesignals.com, and I'll be guiding you through the news. For the second week in a row, our Toke Signals bud pick of the week is this spectacular Frankenberry plant that I'm really proud of right now. I developed this strain by combining Frankenstein with DJ Short blueberry genetics. And as you can tell, she's a natural star. Speaking of stars, she's right here with me, guest starring on this episode. I just couldn't resist showing her to you because she's got it going on. Let's do the news now, shall we? In the United States, a new Gallup poll shows a record 58% of Americans support marijuana legalization. A majority of Americans continue to say marijuana should be legal in the U.S. 58% now hold that opinion, equaling the highest ever support in Gallup's 46-year trend. Support for legalizing recreational cannabis has grown steadily among Americans over time, according to Jeffrey Jones at Gallup. When Gallup first asked the question back in the heady hippie days of 1969, just 12% of Americans said they thought marijuana use should be legal, with little change in two early 1970s polls. But by the late 70s, with tacit approval from the Carter White House, support had increased to about 25% and held near that point through the mid-1990s. The percentage of Americans who favored making cannabis legal passed 30% by 2000 and topped 50% by 2009. Now, support has vacillated over the past 6 years, but averaged 48% from 2010 through 2012 and has averaged above 56% since 2013. The higher level of support comes as many states and localities are changing, or at least considering changing, their laws on cannabis. So far, 4 states, Colorado, Washington, Oregon, and Alaska, have made recreational marijuana use legal, along with the District of Columbia. Ohio voters are set next month to decide a ballot initiative that would do the same thing, albeit in a fashion which hands control of commercial cannabis growing to just 10 wealthy investors who are financing the campaign. The topic has become an issue on the 2016 presidential campaign trail, and several candidates have expressed willingness to let states make their own laws, even though federal law prohibits marijuana for any purpose. One candidate, Bernie Sanders, who's going for the Democratic nomination, has said he would probably vote for legalization if given the chance. These days, it's not especially exciting to see yet another poll showing majority support for legalizing marijuana, but 58% is a very strong share of the American people calling for change, and elected officials should listen, said Tom Angel, chairman of Marijuana Majority. The constant stream of surveys showing public support for ending prohibition is why we're seeing an increasing number of national politicians saying that it's time to at least let states implement their own laws without federal interference. And we're also seeing a growing number of candidates endorsing legalization outright, which shows how mainstream this issue now is, according to Angel. As more states implement marijuana reforms and those laws continue to work as advertised, we're likely to see even more public support, which should soon spur Congress to formally end the criminalization of cannabis under federal law. It's pretty clear which direction our nation is heading on this issue, according to Mason DeVert, Director of Communications for the Marijuana Policy Project. The status quo has shifted, DeVert said. Marijuana prohibition has been a public policy disaster, and most Americans are ready to put it behind us and move on, according to Mason DeVert. The effects of 80-plus years of anti-marijuana propaganda are slowly wearing off, he said. Once people realize that marijuana is actually safer than alcohol, they tend to agree that adults should not be punished just for consuming it. People can see that legalizing and regulating marijuana is going quite well in states like Colorado and Washington, according to DeVert. They see the sky hasn't fallen and that regulation works, and they want to take similar steps forward in their own states. We will likely see at least a handful of states pass these laws over the next year or so, DeVert said. These latest poll results point to the absurdity and even venality of persisting with harsh prohibitionist policies, said Ethan Nadelman, founder and executive director of the Drug Policy Alliance. No other law is enforced so harshly and pervasively, yet deemed unnecessary by so many Americans, he said. spending billions of dollars and arresting 700,000 people annually for violating marijuana laws now represents not just foolish public policy, but also an inappropriate and indecent use of police powers, Nadelman said. Age and party identification continue to be two of the biggest predictors of Americans' opinions on marijuana legalization, by the way. Younger people, Democrats, and independents are most likely to favor legalization, while Republicans and older Americans are least likely to do so. Support among younger Americans 18 to 34 years old has gone from 20% in 1969 to 71% today. But even older folks are more likely to favor legal pot than comparable age groups were in the past. For example, 35% of senior citizens today, aged 65 and older, favor legalization compared with just 4% of senior citizens in 1969. Among all age groups, the increase in support has been proportionately greater over the last 15 years than it was between any of the earlier time periods, showing increasing momentum. Newer generations of adults who are much more inclined to favor legal marijuana use are replacing older generations in the population who were much less inclined to want weed legalized, according to Gallup. Now, given the patterns of support by age, Gallup predicts the percentage of support for legalization will grow even more in the future. These trends suggest that state and local governments may come under increasing pressure to ease restrictions on marijuana use, if not go even further like the states of Colorado, Oregon, Washington, and Alaska, in making recreational marijuana use completely legal, according to Gallup. More big news this week. This from Canada. The new Prime Minister there plans to legalize marijuana. Canada on Monday voted in Justin Trudeau's Liberal Party in a general election, which will have outstanding implications for drug policy reform in that country. The Liberal Party plans to legalize cannabis. The election puts an end to Conservative Party Prime Minister Stephen Harper's 9-year rule, which was marked by a repressive approach to drugs, including a commitment to rolling out mandatory minimum sentences, pushback to effective supervised injection sites that reduce the harms of drug use, and strong opposition to marijuana reform. In contrast, the Liberal Party has promised to legalize and regulate marijuana, and Trudeau has expressed support for harm reduction and the expansion of supervised injection sites across the country. With the election of Justin Trudeau, legalization in Canada is certain. What it will look like and exactly when it happens over the next few years is yet to be hashed out, drug policy specialist Chris Bennett told Hemp News Tuesday afternoon. Prime Minister Trudeau has spoken out for the rights of patients to grow their own medicine and compared it to the brewing of beer. So there is hope that he will follow through with a liberal legalization model. And there's already been discussion on how it has looked in the states that have legalized in the United States, such as Oregon, Colorado, Alaska, and Washington, and what seems to have worked and not worked in those locations, according to Bennett. Last night's victory for Justin Trudeau and the Liberal Party is the single biggest news in global drug policy reform this year, said Ethan Nadelman, Executive Director of the Drug Policy Alliance. It promises a 180-degree turn in Canada's national drug policy, both domestically and internationally, and will hopefully inject new energy and direction into planning the UN General Assembly special session on drugs 6 months from now. If Justin Trudeau and the Liberal Party follow through with their promise to legalize and regulate marijuana, Canada will become the second country in the world to have legalized all aspects of the marijuana market, including production, sale, and consumption, following Uruguay's historic move to do so in 2013. In the U.S., Colorado, Washington, Oregon, Alaska, and D.C. have legalized marijuana, with more states set to vote on regulated marijuana in 2015 and 2016 elections. More good news. In California this week, a huge victory for medical marijuana dispensary in federal court. Medical marijuana providers across the U.S. scored a major victory in federal court on Monday. U.S. District Judge Charles R. Breyer ordered the lifting of an injunction against one of California's oldest medicinal cannabis collectives, the Marin Alliance for Medical Marijuana, MAM, reports David Downs at SF Gate. The injunction can no longer be enforced in the wake of a congressional spending amendment passed by Congress last year. Judge Breyer ruled that the newly enacted Rohrabacher-Farr Amendment prevents the federal government from prosecuting MAM and its founder, Lynette Shaw. The ruling in federal district court for the Northern District of California will have a huge legal impact, according to attorneys. The medical marijuana industry in California and other states has faced a federal crackdown since 2011. Big dispensaries like Harborside Health Center and Berkeley Patients Group are facing federal forfeiture actions. Congress in December defunded the Department of Justice's war on state legal medical marijuana, but the DOJ has continued to narrowly interpret congressional law to continue to crack down. The law's authors say that the DOJ is breaking congressional law by going after state legal medical marijuana providers. Shaw's attorney Greg Anton in June motioned for the court to dissolve the injunction against Shaw, citing the new Rohrabacher-Farr Amendment, Section 538. Judge Breyer ruled that the collective has been complying extensively with California state law. The plain reading of congressional law forbids the Department of Justice from enforcing this injunction against MAM to the extent that MAM operates in compliance with state California law, Judge Breyer ruled. The Justice Department's interpretation of our amendment was completely ludicrous, said Representative Sam Farr, a Democrat from California. It should not have taken a federal judge to explain that to them. Closing dispensaries denies patients access to medicine, clearly preventing states from implementing their own medical marijuana laws. With this ruling, it's time for the department to finally listen to the majority of Americans who want patients to have access to medical marijuana. Fellow amendment sponsor Representative Dana Rohrabacher, a Republican from California, added, after months of experiencing the Department of Justice's refusal to follow the letter and intent of the Rohrabacher-Farr provision, a federal court has finally reined them in. The people's representatives in Congress have on more than one occasion heeded the demands of the American people to allow for the possession, cultivation, and distribution of medical marijuana in states that permit such activities. For the Department of Justice to flout this congressional directive is unfathomable. As such, Judge Breyer's rebuke of DOJ's ridiculous interpretation of our amendment is most welcome, Rohrabacher said. In December of last year, Congress passed the amendment as part of the Omnibus Appropriations Bill, which is currently included in federal law. The amendment bans the DOJ from spending money to prevent the implementation of state-level medical cannabis programs, removing funding for federal medical cannabis raids, arrests, and prosecutions in states where medical cannabis is legal. An updated version of the amendment to include additional states that have since passed medical cannabis laws is currently included in the appropriations bill that achieved overwhelming bipartisan victories on the House floor and in the Senate Appropriations Committee. Now, according to lawyers, the ruling gives protection to every state legal pot shop in the nation facing federal action. It sets a huge precedent that will likely discourage federal prosecutors from going after state legal medical marijuana businesses, according to the law office of attorney Robert Raich. We finally have a federal judge who is taking the authors of the spending amendment seriously when they say that the intent and its wording should be interpreted so that the federal government should not be spending resources prosecuting individuals complying with state law, said a spokesperson for Raich's office. This court decision makes clear that the Justice Department is not above the law and must leave legal state medical marijuana dispensaries alone, said Bill Piper, Director of National Affairs for the Drug Policy Alliance. Cancer, MS, AIDS, and other medical marijuana patients can sleep a little easier tonight, knowing that a federal judge will protect them and the people providing them their medicine. As more states legalize marijuana for medical or non-medical use, the pressure to change federal law will continue to grow, according to Piper. There is a clear bipartisan majority in Congress for letting states set their own marijuana policies, he said. This is a big win for medical marijuana patients and their providers and a significant victory in our efforts to end the federal government's war on marijuana, said Dan Riffle, Director of Federal Policies for the Marijuana Policy Project. Federal raids of legitimate medical marijuana businesses aren't just stupid and wasteful, they're also illegal, Riffle said. In Australia, yet more good news sweeping the globe. The government there is going to introduce a law to legalize medical marijuana. The Australian government under Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull wants to legalize medical cannabis in Australia this year. Australian Health Minister Susan Ley on Friday said she was finalizing changes to the Narcotics Drugs Act to allow cannabis to be grown for medicinal and scientific purposes. The state governments of Victoria and New South Wales have indicated they want to legalize medicinal cannabis and are waiting for a regulatory scheme from the federal government in Australia before they do so. The move comes a few days after Greens leader Richard Di Natale said he would put a separate cross-party bill on the medical marijuana issue to the Australian Senate next month. Lay said the government's planned changes would allow the Department of Health to license medical cannabis growers with obligations and legal requirements for states and territories. The Greens, Labor, and crossbench senators would be consulted along with the states and territories before bringing a final version to Parliament by the end of the year, she said. The model offered by Lay differs from the Greens' proposal, which would create a new national regulator overseeing the cultivation, processing, and distribution of medical marijuana. Senator Di Natale has said that if that bill passes, the independent regulator could be set up this year. Now, according to Lay, there were already licensing systems to legally manufacture and sell medical cannabis products in Australia, but nothing to enable legal production of a safe, legal, and sustainable local supply. This has meant that Australian patients, researchers, and manufacturers have had to try to access international supplies of legal medical cannabis crops and products, but limited supplies and export barriers in other countries have made this difficult, according to Lay. Allowing the cultivation of legal medicinal cannabis crops in Australia under strict controls strikes the right balance between patient access, community protection, and our international obligations, she said. New medicinal cannabis products would continue to be regulated by the Therapeutic Goods Administration under the proposed changes. Patients would still need either a doctor's prescription or a clinical trial to access medical marijuana. In Oregon this week, Congressman Earl Blumenauer called for an end to failed marijuana prohibition. As representatives from the Oregon Cannabis Association visited Capitol Hill in D.C. on Wednesday, Representative Blumenauer on the House floor called for an end to the federal government's failed approach of marijuana prohibition. Mr. Speaker, advocates from the new emerging marijuana industry in Oregon are descending on Capitol Hill at a very critical time for this fledgling industry, Congressman Blumenauer said. They have a report about the implementation of Oregon's ballot measure 91, overwhelmingly approved by voters last year to legalize, tax, and regulate marijuana at the state level. Possession became legal July 1st, Blumenauer said. Retail sales were authorized in existing dispensaries on the 1st of October to significant interest around the state. The first week saw an estimated $11 million in sales. They are working hard to implement the spirit and the letter of the measure, working closely with the Oregon legislature to refine it, learning from the experiences of states like Washington and Colorado that have already legalized adult use. Theirs is a positive story of economic opportunity, product development, tax revenues, more freedom for individuals, and eliminating the racial disparities in the enforcement of a failed policy of prohibition that comes down heavily against young men of color, especially African Americans, Representative Blumenauer said. At the same time, there was a scathing report this week from the Brookings Institution researchers John Hudak and Grace Wallach that called out the roadblocks that are being put in place by law enforcement and federal policies that stifle medical marijuana research, interfering with science and the doctor-patient relationship in ways that are completely unwarranted, counterproductive, and destructive, the congressman from Oregon said. They come at a time when the federal court has told the Drug Enforcement Agency to stop harassing medical providers after Congress clearly passed legislation to protect the industry and, more important, patients' rights to medicine, Blumenauer said. The Rohrabacher-Farr amendment passed with strong bipartisan support, clearly specifying that the federal government should not interfere with state legal medical marijuana operations. The Department of Justice, unfortunately, took an outrageously flawed position which infuriated those of us who authored these provisions and have worked to pass them over the last 2 years, Congressman Blumenauer said. The DEA ignored the law, and the Department of Justice defended them in this unfortunate action. It's the latest example, according to Blumenauer, of how far out of touch the federal government's agencies are with the reality on the ground, with the will of the majority of the American people who think that marijuana should be legal, and with the policies of the president himself, Blumenauer said. President Obama has declared marijuana no more harmful than other perfectly legal substances like tobacco, which is in fact true, and that he had bigger fish to fry than fight against state legalization. Unfortunately, Blumenauer said, some parts of his federal government are still frying those fish. The good news is that the tide has turned, Representative Blumenauer said. As I mentioned, the majority of American people now think marijuana should be legal. 23 states, the District of Columbia, and Guam now have medical marijuana, and 17 more have authorized a limited version of medical marijuana. We have 4 states in the District of Columbia that permit outright adult use, with more states considering this over the course of the next year. All the federal government has to do, As Secretary Clinton recently said in Colorado, is just stay out of the way. Stop interfering, Congressman Blumenauer said. Let legal marijuana businesses have bank accounts. Don't force them to be all cash. Let them deduct their business expenses from their taxes instead of penalizing them with grotesquely punitive levels of tax. Let the states continue in their efforts at reform. Let them treat it just like we do alcohol. The day is fast coming, he said, when the federal policy will be to robustly research and ultimately deschedule or remove marijuana from the Controlled Substances Act, no longer pretending that it is or should be a Schedule I controlled substance, and instead tax and regulate it at the federal level. In the meantime, the states will continue marching forward, Congressman Blumenauer said. The public will continue to request that we on the federal level stop interfering with marijuana, and Congress will continue our efforts with increasingly large bipartisan majorities to make this policy work to replace the failed attempt at marijuana prohibition. In Pennsylvania this week, religious leaders announced their support for medical marijuana. A group of Pennsylvania religious leaders announced their support Wednesday at a news conference on the lieutenant governor's balcony in the Pennsylvania state capitol. They visited with state lawmakers then to convey their support in person. A diverse group of more than 50 clergy members in Pennsylvania signed a statement urging state lawmakers to adopt a comprehensive medical marijuana law this year. We cannot remain silent while people in pain and anguish are deprived of a viable, safe, and responsible remedy, the statement reads. While we may practice different faiths and come from different communities, we share the same commitment to improving the broader community through the practice of humanity, healing, mercy, and compassion. That is why, as leaders within our respective communities of faith, we are joining together to encourage the Pennsylvania General Assembly to adopt sensible, comprehensive medical cannabis legislation. Finally, in Kansas this week, an 80-year-old marijuana dealer pleads guilty in federal court. Now, the dramatic exploits of a lifetime of smuggling came to an end last Thursday when 80-year-old Marshall Herbert Dion entered his guilty plea in federal court to running a huge marijuana dealing and money laundering operation. Dion, who owned houses in Massachusetts, Colorado, and Arizona, had $11 million hidden in a North Reading, Massachusetts storage facility, and once crawled away from a Wisconsin plane crash as thousands of dollars in cash, suspected drug profits, floated through the air around him. Under his plea agreement with federal prosecutors, Dion could serve 5 to 7 years in a federal penitentiary, ending a lucrative career that has spanned decades until a chance traffic stop in, of all places, Kansas. Over the course of the conspiracy, he had sold approximately 3,000 to 10,000 kilograms of marijuana, Assistant U.S. Attorney Leah Foley claimed during a brief court hearing. Mr. Dion has embraced his responsibility and is looking forward to the next chapter in his life, said his lawyer, Hank Brennan. The end began for Dion's smuggling career with a June 2013 traffic stop in Junction City, Kansas. A police officer pulled him over for driving 80 in a 75 zone. During the stop, the officer searched Dion's old pickup and found nearly $850,000 in cash. That sparked a federal investigation that led to the discovery of $2 million in a bank account, another $880,000 in an Arizona building, and the Massachusetts storage facility where authorities found 395 pounds of cannabis and $11 million in cash. Foley told U.S. District Judge Denise Casper that authorities discovered travel logs indicating Dion had sold more than 3,000 kilos of marijuana, and possibly as much as 10,000 kilos since 1992. Dion was convicted in Massachusetts in the late 1980s of drug trafficking after police in Boston found about 180 pounds of weed in a 1986 Chrysler sedan. Police later found 101 pounds of cannabis stashed in a storage building in Linfield. After a plane crash in Wisconsin in 1985, Dion was found crawling through a muddy field. He denied that the $112,000 in cash found inside the plane and floating through the air was his. He could get 60 to 87 months for conspiracy to deal marijuana, possession with intent to sell, and money laundering under the deal he reached with prosecutors. He had faced a mandatory minimum of 10 years if he had been convicted in a trial. Dion's sentencing is scheduled for February 11th. That's all we have for this week. Until next time, stay lifted. See you then.